Sound good? Okay. All right. Here, we'll pretend I just got here. Hi, everybody. I am Richard Mitchell. I feel like I have to be formal since we're live streaming this time with the Tulsa Game Developers Group, and this is our second go at trying to live stream one of our events. This month we have the fabulous Michael Lister here. He's going to tell us all about 3D sculpting using a program called ZBrush, which is 90 bucks? 150. So, I mean, for like a pretty powerful graphics program, that's actually not that bad. And we're going to be learning about 3D sculpting, and I won't try to explain it because that's what he's here for. Next month, we're actually going to do what we were planning for today, which is a hands-on 3D sculpting workshop. So if you like what Michael's going to show you today, next month, we're going to take a free version of this program called Sculptress, and you can actually try it out yourself, and it'll actually run on relatively low-end hardware. We'll also have, oh my God, Eric, what's his last name? Eric Lee is going to be here from Steelhouse Productions, and he's going to show us the same concept only in virtual reality. So he does VR sculpting, and it's really cool. And he's actually done some work with Michael to like print out some chess pieces that Eric Lee has sculpted in 3D in VR. It's like the nerdiest possible thing you could do. But Michael Lister's here, and ProImage 3D, is that right? ProImage 3D. Please feel free to plug that when you get up here. So next month, third Thursday, I probably should have looked up the date before I got up here. We're going to have that 3D sculpting workshop, and without any further delay, here's Mike Lister.
All right, how's it going, everybody? Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, good? All right, so Richard touched on it just a little bit, but just so you guys know a little bit of background about me and what I do, I'm consider myself as a digital artist, and I work for a company called ProImage 3D, and typically what we do is we take people's invention ideas and we help them build the first prototypes of it. So mostly what I do for them is I handle any of our pre-visualization work, any of the company's in-house animations and things like that that we work on, or any soft sculpting things that come through. So if we've got like statues or figurines, or things like that, those are where I come through. What we're going to be working on today is a program called ZBrush, and I actually want to clarify a little bit from what Richard was talking about earlier. There's actually two separate versions of ZBrush available. So there's the full kit and caboodle ZBrush, which is the main program. That's $800, I believe. Yeah, that's a big price tag. But thankfully, the good people at Pixologic have left us ZBrush Core, which I think they announced last year. And that is, it's a minor version of ZBrush that's only $150, which is a much cheaper price tag, and you get most of the essentials that you're going to need for anything in that. As the idea states, it is the core program. And what this demonstration is going to be about, we're not really going to get into the art side of things a whole lot as far as like form and function, and I'm not going to teach you how to draw, basically. But what I am going to cover here is a lot of the basics. So like, I want to help make sure that any of the coders out in the audience or any of the art people who don't typically do digital sculpting and things like that can kind of have an understanding of like what polygons are, how geometry functions, why you have to worry about resolution and UV maps, and kind of how all those things interact together. So without further ado, let's kind of dig into this. Pull up actual ZBrush. Okay, so this is the main ZBrush interface. This is the generic stock file of how everything looks when you first bring it up. I do want to point out, I'm not going to go into this into too much detail, but you can, this whole interface is configurable. So if you come up here and you can go into, what is it, interface? Config. And if I go into restore my custom user interface, so this is what I typically see when I'm in ZBrush. This is what I work in, this is my workflow, and so you can see it's much, much less busy than what the default version is, because I typically use tons and tons of shortcuts and things like that. But just so that you guys are aware, anytime you're getting into this and as you get more and more comfortable with the program, you'll start moving stuff around and removing buttons and adding tools and just kind of gear it towards your workflow. I've got this one that is my generic kind of interface, and then I've got another one that I use if I'm doing a lot of like poly painting and texturing and stuff. But since this is a kind of a demo, we are going to stay in the standard ZBrush interface. And so if any of you guys are following along with this at another point in time, all you have to do is come back to this preferences, config, and you'll come in just to restore standard UI, and you'll get back to the fun of it all. So what we're going to do real quick is we're just going to come in and open up a file. And I've got this demo project here. And I'm not going to cover everything just yet, but I want to take a few minutes up front to kind of cover basically like I was talking before with how polygons work and how all that's going to interact. So everything that you see in any kind of a 3D software is typically going to be polygons. And what that means is it's going to be these four-sided faces that make up everything. So no matter how high of a resolution you get, any kind of sculpting that you see in ZBrush, you're not actually sculpting on true clay. It's just these little bitty faces that cover the entire object. And so the same goes true for any of these. And you can see this is a much lower resolution. And now how this kind of works is any polygonal geometry that you see needs to be these four-sided faces. No more. You can go a little less. Like, so you can have 3 if you wanted to. It used to be that ZBrush wouldn't take any kind of triangle at all, but typically you want to try and keep your geometry as clean as possible. So anything that's, you can see up here, where they've got triangles coming into a point. But you don't want what are called n-gons, which is anything that has more than 4 points connecting it. So you can see on any of these squares, 1, 2, 3, 4 points. And on these triangles, of course, 1, 2, and 3. You want to keep within those confines because anything more than that, ZBrush can't subdivide it. And what that's saying is whenever we're going into this and you want to sculpt, like if you tried to sculpt on this cube, you're not going to be able to do a whole lot. You know, it's really, really low resolution. You're basically just pulling points. So once you start subdividing this down and adding more and more faces, even though these lines are the same, it's just blanking out that geometry. But you can see there are many, many smaller faces on here. And if you've got anything that ZBrush doesn't understand how to compute, it's not going to crunch that down at all. And so you'll be stuck, you know, not being able to subdivide and thus getting clean geometry. And that's all this sculpting is. So just to be clear, you have to have the resolution needed to do the work that you need. Which is, of course, you know, that any of you are familiar with video games and Unreal Engine or Unity or anything like that, you understand that you can't bring these really high-resolution sculpted models into the lower version. So hopefully today we'll get into a little bit of that too. All right, so the only other thing I wanted to touch on is kind of completed files. So if you've got an object that isn't a solid object, like this sphere, this cube, and you've just got a flat plane, oh, you can't see the other side of it. And what that is that every polygon on here has normals. And so basically all a normal is the direction that these polygons are facing. And so if you think about it, like all of these polygons here on this plane are facing outward that way. And so when you're seeing them from behind, you're seeing the back side of that normals. And typically that's not displayed because it's just more that the machine has to render. And so if you're not seeing the back side of it, you're not rendering you know, all of these faces, you're just rendering this side of it. And so it's not rendering the inside of this sphere or the inside of this cube because it's not being seen. Now, if you are in a strange situation where you do have single plane geometry or something like that, then you can always just come down here into the display, which is somewhere on this list. I promise it's normally here. Oh, there it is, display properties, just hiding from me. And you can turn on double-sided geometry. And so now once you look at the back side of this plane, I guess it helped if I had the right polygon selected. Turn on double-sided geometry, and now you can see both sides of it. But that's all that's controlling is just those normals and showing whether or not the back side of your normals are rendered. All right, so let's get into this to a little further. And if you guys ever have any questions or I don't explain something clearly, feel free to ask. There are plenty of people out there doing tutorials who are much better at this than I am. And so your most benefit's going to be asking me to explain the things that I'm not explaining clearly. So let's get into this. So we'll start breaking it down and just kind of go over what everything on this interface does. So this is ZBrush 4 R8, and this was released just a few days ago. And so a lot of this, if you guys are familiar with ZBrush at all, this is probably looking a little bit different. And they flattened out the interface. They've taken out some of the odder functions, and you're going to see a few new buttons up here. So let's just kind of go over what some of these things are. Your biggest button is going to be this home page. This is brand new. And what this is going to take you to is ZBrush. And it pulls up your main settings, and it should, I believe, try this again. Yeah, it's just going to open up that ZBrush core. What it can also take you to are websites like ZBrush, the Z Classroom. They've got tons of tutorials and stuff like that based off that are totally free. It's a great stepping stone for getting into this stuff. ZBrush Central is their top row. And so this is basically kind of their community posting forums. We see everybody posting work who is much better at this than you or I are. This is where I come for any kind of inspiration or just to remind myself that you really can do much better work. And then, of course, the ZBrush homepage, which is this where you can just come to buy all of their program softwares and stuff like that. And here you can come down to even like ZBrush Live. This is kind of a new thing, but I've been super jazzed about it. And basically, every single day, they're doing streams and events for ZBrush podcasting and stuff. So there's always different, every single day, they've got 2 or 3 guys that'll come on, and for 3 or 4 hours each, we'll just go over their sculpting process on everything from stylized characters, speed sculpting, characters for 3D printing, all kinds of stuff. It's definitely worth checking out. Now back into ZBrush, the next thing that I want to talk about, just kind of following down the list here, is going to be the Lightbox. The Lightbox is kind of like ZBrush's in-house folder, and essentially all of this stuff is stored just like a normal folder system somewhere on your machine. But this is their quick access pass, so if you want certain brushes, you can come in here and find all of anything that you want to pull out of here. You've got textures, alphas, materials, different noise patterns, and even once you start loading up different documents and stuff all your own, it'll pull in like a quick save folder, and so it backs up to old files that you were tinkering with before, and basically anything that you want to get into. Live Boolean is the newest tool for ZBrush. This was their big thing for 4 or 8. If any of you guys are familiar with Boolean operations, it's basically adding and subtracting 2 separate objects from each other. And we're going to get into that a lot more later in the demonstration. The edit tool. So this is kind of complicated. When you actually first open up ZBrush, you're in a kind of a 2D mode. And so if I click this edit, you'll notice that this white rectangle around my preview has disappeared. And what that's showing is whether or not you're actually in 3D mode. So ZBrush also has a kind of sculpting formula that they call 2.5D. And what 2.5D is it's almost like if you were painting in Photoshop and it has a Y layer to it. So if I was going to come in here and grab like this simple brush and start sculpting, hopefully, you can see that it's just building up blocks, and cubes on top of each other. And it's on top of this, and it kind of interacts with each other. And this is really for, I don't know what. I've never seen anybody use 2.5D for anything, and it's just kind of that weird thing that's in ZBrush for reasons unknown. Maybe an early program thing that they wanted to explore at one point and decided to move away from. But that's basically all it is. And so what this is this whole document area here, your workspace, is basically just like a painting screen at this point. So you can just draw on here whatever you want. If you want to get a star, you can drag out stars and stuff like that and kind of remove them from each other. And it's interesting to play around with. And I'm sure somebody out there is doing really crazy cool art stuff with it. But it's not something that is typically used for any kind of like game engine stuff or anything like that. So just to clear this out, if I hit edit, you can see that we're now functioning on this one star again. And if you hit Control-N, you'll just clear out the back of that document and pull you into basically back into 3D space. So what you want to keep in mind is that edit, which the shortcut is for T, is going to take you in and out of 3D mode. Get back into our spheres here. That'll work. So the next over are your draw, move, scale, and rotate tools. And these are your generic tools for, just like it says, draw, move, scale, and rotate. What's really cool, and once again, if you guys are familiar with ZBrush, you're seeing this new little button here, this cool little gizmo. And that's exactly what they're calling it. It's your Gizmo 3D tool. And so until yesterday, basically, ZBrush didn't have this traditional, move, scale, and rotate tool, like what you would think for any basic 3D program. What ZBrush used was this wonky thing right here. I don't know if I can do it right. It'd be on the... Oh, I know what the issue is. Polymesh 3D. Here we go. All right, and so this was your translate tool in ZBrush. This really weird, wonky line thing. And nobody really liked it, which is why we finally got the gizmo tool. It's pretty functional, but basically the breakdown is that if you're in Move, which we are now, if you grab this center handle, you can translate it in any direction. So it's kind of the free form. If you're grabbing it at the bottom, you can squash and stretch. And by holding Shift and dragging out, you can kind of snap to alignments. Or if you freehand it, you can set it to basically anywhere that you want. And it kind of snaps to your vertices. But this was what ZBrush used for translation. If you go into rotate, you can grab it and you're actually translating along this base axis. If you grab it here, you can translate along this axis, and then you can grab it from the bottom. And then scale, which I'm just using the shortcuts for these to pop back into between them. So Q for draw, W for move. I think it's E for scale and R for rotate. It's pretty straightforward, but that's how this interesting little tool functioned. And it's kind of weird to get used to, but once you do it, just became kind of one of those standard functions of ZBrush. But as I said, as of yesterday, if you guys are working in ZBrush 4R8 and up, we now have the Gizmo 3D tool, which is basically much more aligned to what your typical transform tools are going to work like if you're familiar with any kind of 3D software. And the next is, these are all control handles for your brushes and for the material editor. And we'll also be getting into those a little later down the line too. We'll come back over here, and so this is your tool panel. And now this doesn't have to be over here on the right. Like I said, everything in ZBrush is totally customizable. So if you notice, you've got these little divider arrows here. If you want to click on these, you can move them in and out and just open and close new things. And what this is all for is basically once you get into the point where you're customizing this, everything in ZBrush can just kind of be dragged and docked into new things. So if I want, let's say, the like this Preferences tab, and I want to dock it down here, I guess you can't dock it in the bottom. But it's going to snap it over here to the side. And you can do the same thing over here. You just kind of pull. If you Alt-click on it, it'll get rid of it. But if you wanted your Movie tab, you can pull that off. If I ask it nicely, it'll let me. And basically, it's just another tool for customizing in ZBrush. This is your this is the tool panel, which is also up here. If you pull down this, you'll notice once I open this up, it'll open this all into the same thing. So if I come into Tool, excuse me, this is your Preferences panel right now. Open up this Tool panel and dock it over here. But basically, once I open it up here, it's that same panel. That's why it's snapping back and forth. And so you've got everything here from alphas, brushes, colored channels. This is document control. Now, to be clear, this isn't documents like what you would think of as for files. So if you're trying to export OBJs or anything like that, you're not going to pull that from this. It's kind of confusing. What this is this area here, your workspace, is actually your document panel. And so just like we were talking about with that 2.5D, if you go out of this edit mode, this is now just your document. So anything that you're adjusting here, this is what you're controlling, is this background. So if I came into this document and started playing with, like say, let's change the range of it. You can see I can change this background. But that's what this document banner is controlling. And if you export, save as, or you're just pulling basically screenshots of this document panel out from here. Next is draw, and what this is kind of, it's more like the, it's not your brushes, but think of this like the tip of your brush. And like I said, we've got a whole section on brushes that I'm getting to here in a little while. But this basically is going to control like pen pressure, your draw size, the focal shift, and the intensity. And all of these are also docked over here. And the edit is going to be for undos and stuff like that. File. Now this is what you would probably think of as typically like your documents, but not for the complex files. So what this is going to open is any of your ZBrush projects. as a full file, and I think that's what they're actually called, is a .zpr file. And so anytime you're working in ZBrush, you'll typically save your master file as that ZPR file. Here we've got layers, and it's kind of like Photoshop layers. We're not going to get into these a whole lot today, but this is essentially used for like morphing between two objects and setting up different things like that. Lighting is, of course, your lighting, so if you were going to come in here, and it's kind of hard to see from this angle, let's turn our polygroups off. So this is actually what ZBrush will typically look like when you're sculpting in it, is you've got this default matte cap material in here. And what I'm doing is, just to see the wireframe, you can turn on this polyframe over here, and it just lets you see those lines. They're always there. The polygons are always there. They're not going away. It's just a display setting. So if we were to change this around, I think it shows up if you render it at best. But you can see now the lighting is coming from below instead of above. If you get into macros, so macros are kind of like if you've ever used macros for video game functions, or like in Photoshop where you can set it up to do multiple tasks at the same time. You can build the same thing in ZBrush. So I know people who use, like, if they've got a specific render material that they like to use, it's real common to see, like, they'll set up a render pass. So it'll say, you know, render for material. And so instead of swapping to the material, setting up their lighting just the way they want it and all that, they've got a one-button push that'll run through all those activities for them, and then one right below that that runs it all the way back. So basically, instead of going through all the trouble of, if you've got a certain function that you run all the time, like say you're going to divide 3 times and then cut it in half, and then multiply your subtools or something, if you had a bunch of operations to run at once, you'd create a macro for it. And that way you just hit that button and you run through those tools. Marker is for like references and stuff like that. If you're wanting to like knock out a position in the tool and you're trying to do like posing reference or something. The next thing is material. Now material is what you're seeing kind of displayed here. And so if you come through and swap out with different things, it's basically just how are you viewing that object. And the default is called this matte cap red. And what this is just a real high fidelity material, I guess would be the good way to put it, is it's going to show any crease, any deformation that you make on it, shows up really, really well in this matte cap red. A lot of people don't like to sculpt on it because it's a little extreme for what you'll actually see. And so there's kind of a trick to working with materials for exporting, because what you have to understand is it's not going to look exactly the way it does in ZBrush by the time you take it into Unreal Engine or whatever your dev game is going to be. Movie is kind of, a lot of people see movie and they think, oh yeah, this is where I do like my renders and stuff from, or you know, where you're going to try and export videos. What these movies are actually for are actually like screen recordings and stuff like that. ZBrush uses it for people who want to do tutorials, and they can just basically record every action that they're taking over a period of time on this screen. And so you can even do like turntables and stuff like that, where it's just going to automatically set up a camera to do a 360 rotate around your object and then export that for you. But it's not a true render whenever you're exporting them like that either. Yeah, yeah, but it's not like it's rendering it and taking from the screen grab. It's actually the entire screen zone that you're seeing. Like, it'll show all of your mouse movements and anything that you're working on during that export. And preferences we've talked about just a little bit. Preferences are, I mean, as basic as it gets, preferences. It's all of your options, anything that you need to worry about as far as memory, performance issues, any of the tools that you're going to work with, that's where you're going to go. And then render. Now, there's, ZBrush has a whole plethora of render tools to get into. I don't think we're going to get too far into it today, but this is where you're going to work on like basically like any depth of field or things like that. Anything that basically this button over here, this best preview render, is going to show you. And that's where you alter the settings for that. Stencils are like what you would think for alphas, like if you were going to actually have a real life stencil and working with masking and stuff, and we're going to get into that a little while later too. The stroke is, if you're going to think of the draw as the tip of your brush, the stroke is kind of what you're doing with that brush. So if you want it to be kind of sprayed on, or drawn out in rectangles, then this is where you're going to go to control that. And like I said, we'll get into all of this again here in a little while. Texturing is where you're going to handle all of your texture stuff, and that's also where ZBrush keeps the spotlight. And the spotlight is their kind of a reference and painting tool. And what you can do with that is basically if you were going to hold up an image and spray through that image, it would paint the texture onto your object. So we'll get into that a little while later, but think of if you were applying a texture to the end of your brush, it's kind of similar to that. Tools are what we've discussed before. This is probably the most used panel that you'll have in all of ZBrush. This is where it tracks all of your subtools, any of the files that you want to export that aren't ZBrush files, you're going to come here for. This is where you're going to alter your geometry, like I said, subtools, any deformations that you're going to want to make. The texture maps are listed here, the UV maps are here, and that's why the tool panel is usually kept on this right-hand panel of ZBrush. And that's the default placement for it. Transforms are like we talked about before. You guys saw the wonky transform tool for ZBrush. You can also access any of these buttons here or over here on the side. And then Z plugins. This is where ZBrush keeps all of its cool plugins, and I think just about all of their plugins come standard. I notice Pixologic doesn't have a lot of interest in doing like third-party stuff, so you'll see them every once in a while. But typically, most of the plugins that you're going to want for ZBrush, Pixologic just kind of includes it in the base gap, even though they're technically not part of the core program. So if you download ZBrush, you're getting the plugins with it. And then Z-scripting, I would assume this is probably for mostly your coding guys. I've never used it before, but this is kind of how you set up actions and stuff like that and want to do a more in-depth editing of ZBrush. I think that's most of the stuff for the user interface that's major. You've got more brushes over here. And like I said, everything in ZBrush can be moved around. So this brush panel can also be accessed from brushes here and just going into the same thing. This alpha panel is just a quick shortcut to the alphas. This texture panel is just a quick shortcut to the textures, materials, color gradients, and so on. Now these down here we can talk about a little bit. We'll talk about it more once we get into poly painting. Basically, this is just the colors that you have selected right now. So if I was going to turn this to a darker black, it'll apply that to your overall material. And that looks kind of weird because we've got that matte cap red on. And something like I said, we'll talk about more in a little bit, but there's a difference between materials and the color on it. A material is more like the renderable properties of the face, whereas the color is the actual texture color applied to it in that space. So we've talked about customizing the interface. We've gone over the interface in general a little bit. We talked about getting started. We've done 2.5D. So let's get into geometric creation just a little bit more. So, so far we've started out, and I've already had all these little cubes and stuff created. If you're actually wanting to create geometry on your own, what you're going to do is come down here and pick a subtool. If you click on any of these tools, like this Sphere 3D, you're going to get this little panel. And from here, you can pick any of the basic primitives that you'd see in any kind of modeling software. So if you're thinking of a cylinder, cones, rings, profiled sweeps, planes, helixes, gears. Let's do the gear. That's kind of a cool one. And so once you select that gear, it's not an editable object just yet. See, once I try and sculpt on it, it says to enable sculpting, please convert this primitive to a polymesh 3D. Now, what that's wanting is you to come up here and say, make this object a polymesh 3D. And essentially what that's saying is it's taking this out of a baked state. So this geometry right now, if we want to come down here to, I believe it's this initialize panel, you can change all kinds of things about this shape without actually editing the geometry. Think of it like a creation node. So you still haven't fully created this object until you've made it a polymesh 3D. It's more like an understanding of the object. So if I back this coverage off, you can edit these shapes. If you want to change the skewer of it a little bit, you can change the outer profile. alter the strength of the brush, the noise to it, any kind of like variation in it that you want. So lots of cool stuff in this initiation palette. Now the thing is now once you make this a Polymesh 3D, you'll notice it's created it as another tool up here. Now it's called PM3D Gear 1. And now that's different from what we were just editing, which is just the typical Gear 1 right here, Gear 3D 1. Now we can sculpt on it, we can move stuff around, we can shift it and do whatever we want with it, but we no longer have that initialize panel down here. It's no longer an editable shape. Now it's more like a digital clay. So let's see, what do we want to do next? Let's say transforming 3D objects. Okay, so that's a good thing to get into. We've talked about, like I said, how this scale and rotate tool works, but the new and improved thing for ZBrush is this Gizmo 3D. And it's actually got a lot of really cool features to it. So if you had multiple subtools set up at once, so if you had, say, we wanted to append a cylinder to this, select this cylinder, and all I'm doing to swap between these subtools is Alt and left clicking on them, and I can move this over. And now we've got, a couple things in here at once. So if I wanted to move all of these things at once, it used to be a real pain of shifting one up, shifting the other up, or you had to merge all your subtools down and split them apart again. This new Gizmo tool, if you can select this all subtools thing, and now you can move all of them at once, rotate them together, scale them together, and do all these little adjustments without having to worry about different patterns and stuff like that. So that's the new and improved Gizmo tool. You can also bounce it back to the center pivot, move it to the center axis. This sticky mode actually locks it into place so that you can't move that axis around. So if I was going to Alt-click, well, I thought that's what it did. Keep in mind that this tool just came out a few days ago. Go easy on me. And then the other cool thing that's technically part of this Gizmo tool, but it's really an entire new feature for ZBrush as well. And that's going to be the Customize. And what this is you can take these basic subtools and transform them and swap them out with any other subtool on here. And that's pretty cool on its own. So if you didn't want this to be a cone, you just click it and now it's in a different subtool. Move on, say we wanted it to be a plane, and swapping it out. And that's easy, so if you wanted to come in here and you can Alt and click, or is it Control and click? Control Shift click? No? You duplicate your subtool, and so you've got multiple objects in here now that you're wanting to move around. And instead of trying to come up and append a new subtool and make it Polymesh 3D and make sure everything's meshing like it's supposed to, you can just automatically pull up one of these other primitives to swap in between with, which is kind of handy. But the big piece of it is the new addition is going to be the deformations. And this is something that ZBrush kind of had in a different panel before, but now you actually have lattices. And what lattices are basically like, think of them like a soft selection for your tools. So if we wanted to grab this, let's do a bend arc, maybe a flatten. So as you can see, we've kind of got this bounding box around our tool now. And as you're grabbing on any of these, you can stretch it and deform it in different directions. Now this gets really handy if you're working with complex pieces of geometry and you're trying to shift the whole thing at once without going in with a huge move brush and trying to shift and move things around. And then I think you can change the different strength levels for this by selecting this tool back here and pulling on it. You're changing the how much that deformation is affecting it. So just another cool little thing that ZBrush can do now. Next, let's get into the Gizmo tool. All right, so let's dig a little deeper into subdivisions and how that works. So in ZBrush, anything that you've got is polygons, and it's always going to be in polygons. But if you're going to come down here into your geometry section under your tools, this is kind of the control hub for all of your tools and stuff. What you're going to do is here, if you come to higher res, and the shortcut for that is just going to be D or Control D. And it's going to ask if you want to go ahead and subdivide this. Say yes. And so what this is kicked into is dynamic subdivision mode. And so this is kind of like if you've ever worked with subdivisional surfaces in other programs before. Think of it like the mix between a NURBS curve and a hard polygon. And so what that means is it's using these control points to understand like how strong you want that angle to be. So you can push and pull and move stuff around on that. What we really need to do is come up here, make sure this is a Polymesh 3D. And the traditional divide tool is going to be Control D. And now what that's done is, as you can see, it's going to multiply each of these faces by 4. And it's kind of hard to see here. If you take any of these and move across it, you'll see that now we've got way more faces than we did before. You can Control D again. And now we've got even more subdivisional surfaces than we did before. And then once more. And now you can keep going and going until, before you know it, you've got basic digital clay. And now it looks smooth and it runs well and everything, but in truth, this is about 500,000 points. And which is fine for ZBrush. But if you're trying to take this into any other program, it's going to be really, really dense at this state. So what we'll cover eventually is how to reduce this back down into a much more usable state. Biggest point about this is just to keep in mind that the more you subdivide, it's going to smooth things out and add geometry. So all of this is going to get a little smoother and a little denser every time. But you also can't get into digital sculpting without it. The other thing to talk about is, what if you wanted to move things out without creating new shapes? So say you're working on this blob and it's going to be a nose or a face or whatever you want. You're pulling and stretching on stuff. And as you notice, as these faces get further and further out here, they're starting to get kind of weird, right? What you're doing is you're taking those polygons, that's all it's ever going to be is just polygons. And so you've stretched them out to their extreme now. And so you get these weird fractal patterns and things like that. And it's something to be aware of. And you can kind of massage it. If you smooth it out, you can pull it further and smooth some more and kind of work with it, but you're still not editing the actual geometry of the part at all. ZBrush's most powerful features is called Dynamesh. And essentially what Dynamesh is like a quick remesh of your entire part. So if we actually lower our resolution on this a little more, you can see how there's few parts up here. You know, you've got more dense polygons down here than you do up here. But if you need this to clean up, say you're wanting to do high detail on whatever this extension is going to be, you're going to want to use Dynamesh. And Dynamesh is here and it's under your geometry panel. Like I said, most of the time you're going to be staying within this geometry or subtool panel. And it's right in here. And this is going to control the resolution of it. And so if we just hit this Dynamesh button, and okay, so what Dynamesh doesn't like is anytime you've got multiple resolutions to your object. So if you say, let's cancel this for now, back up. What it's seeing is since we've got this subdivision set here, ZBrush keeps track of all that, and it's listed here in this little slider. So you can move up and down your resolutions at will without losing any geometry. And that's good for just kind of keeping track of where your base is at. If you were working from, say if this was your the model you were going to take into the game, and you know that all these polygons are working the way you want them to, you can always just kind of keep track of where those are at and how that's moving by moving up and down this slider. But if you're wanting to Dynamesh, ZBrush won't let you Dynamesh with this high resolution sculpt. So what you could do is come in here and delete this higher and say you need to just remesh this whole thing. What this Dynamesh will do is make really, really dense geometry. But it's even all the way through it now. And so no matter what shape you've got, no matter how much we pull and say we did it on this side, and see now we're taking this and stretching it to the extreme and stuff like that. If we Dynamesh it again, and you can come over here and turn Dynamesh off and then back on, and it will remesh. But a shortcut for that is if you just control, click, and drag out here without touching the object, then it'll remesh it for you without having to come in and turn it on and turn it off. And you can play with this resolution, say maybe that's a lot higher than you wanted your base mesh to be. Drop it down to like a resolution of 8, which is really low. And run it again. going to make fun of me now because it knows that people are watching. All right, so let's try again. Resolution of, let's do 56. Control, click, and drag, and now it's a much less dense Dynamesh. So, of course, the opposite applies if you really wanted to crank it. And control, click, and drag. And this is your loading bar at the top. Anytime you're seeing anything run across the top like that, it's ZBrush thinking about it. You can see now we have a really, really dense polygonal model that's 3.352 million active points. And so even though these look like hard edges, this is actually really, really dense geometry. So if we come in here and take a brush and just kind of sculpt and pull on it or smooth it out, you can see that there's much more information there than what you're seeing. But that's also the remnants of those high poly count. So that's Dynamesh. And basically, one of the cool things about Dynamesh is we haven't gotten into subtools a whole lot yet, but if you come over and append a new subtool, and let's say you wanted to add a sphere to this object, these spheres in this subtool panel are totally separate from each other. So you can move this around, and it's just, I mean, it's like a separate object, basically. They're not referencing each other at all. If you were to merge these two together and merge those subtools, please. Just wanted me to hit enter on the keyboard. Now you've merged them as subtools, or not. There it goes. Now it did it. Just wanted me to ask it again. Now these are still technically two different objects. You haven't merged them into one piece yet. So if you come in here to the polyframes, you'll notice that they're two different colors. And this is still a much lower resolution than the other one. And if you control shift and click, you can isolate it. And then move it out. And then control shift and click again. And they're still technically two separate objects, even though they're both in the same subtool. So if they're both visible, it still sees them and categorizes them as two things, or as one object, but there's two separate groups of meshes inside that subtool. So but if you come in here with your, let's say with Gizmo tool here, and move that back to where the other subtool is. And now if you run Dynamesh, magical Dynamesh panel. Just run Dynamesh again. Drop the resolution a little bit. And it's thought about it, and then it crunches through. And now you'll notice that they're both much denser objects now. And if you actually come in here and hide our polyframe, you start smoothing this out, notice it's merged them into one object. I mean, this is just another way that if you were adding more geometry onto the object or something like that before you were sculpting, it's just another way to kind of add clay, basically. You're just adding more geometry. So let's get into some of the more fun side of things. Now, I think everybody kind of gets, at this point, should have at least an okay understanding of how geometry works and kind of what's going on with this subtool panel. So let's go ahead and dig into the brushes. Now, your brushes are kind of the bread and butter of ZBrush. And in ZBrush, you have just a plethora of brushes. And all of these, every one of them has all kinds of customizable settings. You can create your own brushes just like you would in Photoshop with different alphas, strokes, textures, and all of that fun stuff included. And there's several different types of brushes, too. So this Select Lasso is also a brush. But it's not a sculpting brush. It would be like a selection brush. So if I was to hold Control and Shift, you'll see my brushes are changing over here. And what this is if I wanted to see certain parts of the object only, then I can highlight it. And this is a good tool if you're wanting to keep down. And once you start getting into really high poly counts, like 30 or 40 million or something crazy like that, you're looking at lots and lots of crunch time. If you've got tons and tons of subtools, and you're just not wanting to deal with all of it and masking them off, that's what these selection tools are for. There's also some other stuff to do with polygroups. those are some kind of advanced stuff, and we'll touch on that if we get the chance. But that's just to illustrate that you've got all kinds of brushes in here that you can work with. So if I just control-click again, control-shift-click out here in open space, it'll bring back your full object. Next thing we want to talk about is the traditional brushes, which are going to be like the clay buildup brush. So you've noticed that there's a whole lot of stuff here, and you've got different like commands for each of these things. So you've got like references on this alphabet up top. I believe if you click up here, it should reference it for you. But what it's saying is that all of these brushes are shortcutted to different things. So for example, like if I'm going to open up the brush panel, I know I can hit B, and it's going to pull that up without me having to go all the way up here and grabbing it. So if I hit B, and I know I want, let's say, the clay buildup brush. So clay buildup, I know the command prompt for that is C, and it's going to show me all of these that begin with a C, and then I can hit B right here for clay buildup. And C, B, and now I've got the clay buildup brush selected. So anytime I'm sculpting, now I've got this other brush. And if I wanted to say I want the damn standard tool, it's just going to hit B to open up your brush panel, then the command DS, and then you can grab that here. And then you're just sculpting with another brush. And you can move in and out of stuff just like that. And if I went back to the standard brush, which is ST, I believe, and then now I'm back into your generic sculpting tools. So the other major type of brush is going to be your IMM brushes, which is the insert mesh tools. And now this is kind of like a faster way for dynameshing. And so anytime that these IMM tools, it's like basically part files. So if you select any of these things, it's going to act kind of weird. And this is actually new to ZBrush 4R8 up here, is this little menu. I believe if you hold down the M key, yeah, this used to be the other way to get to it, is if you hit M whenever you had one of these insert mesh brushes accepted, then you're going to open this up, and it's basically like pre-created objects that are stored into this brush. And so if we wanted like this little belt buckle or something, you can actually come in here, and it's going to drag it out onto that surface, and then what it's doing is it's masking everything else. And so what you can do then is just control, click, and drag, and it kind of meshes that back into it. And so now that's the same function for Dynamesh. And generally what you're going to do is control, click, trick, and glad. You've added this as a separate object to the part, or multiple separate objects, and then control, drag again, and now you've meshed it into the part, and it's going to be one piece. And it looks like these were just barely touching, so you can see it kind of reached to make that connection there. That's what the insert mesh brush is, and this is really handy for if you were doing like, you wanted like a bunch of bolt rivets or something like that, and you just wanted to kind of draw out all these little pieces, and then control, click, control, drag, and it'll crunch on in a minute, and then they're applied to your object. And so that's the bulk of the brushes. This is something that you can really play around with as much as you want. Like the flatten's another really great one, so if you're trying to get sharper angles or something, you come in and push in. Oh, and the other thing I haven't touched on yet is, of course, the smooth brush. So anytime you hold shift, so you're switching to, by default, it's going to be this smooth brush. And what that is anytime you go a little too far and get a little heavy-handed with stuff, you can just smooth it all back out. And that's by just holding down the shift key, and you'll notice your little reticle is going to turn red for sculpting on. Shift is going to smooth. Then if you hold Alt, you're actually doing the opposite of whatever your brush's default pattern is. So if I was going to do, like, let's say the clay buildup brush. It's one of my favorite brushes. And you're sculpting on here, and it's pulling up on anything that you're sculpting on. If you actually hold down the Alt key, you're pushing in now. And so that's true of any of these brushes. Anything that you're, if you hit that Alt key, it's basically the subtraction to it. And you can actually switch this up here too. And so these are like kind of the panels for controlling your brushes. So here I can change the size of the brush. You see my reticle getting larger and smaller. Change the intensity. So if I crank this up to like 45 or something, you'll see it's now a much stronger stroke tool. And if you're using a tablet, which I highly recommend, ZBrush is any kind of sculpting tool. Is going to be really, really clunky if you're just trying to do this with a mouse and keyboard. my tablet is kind of touch sensitive. So if I push lightly, it's going to start out small. And if I push in harder, I can get a much larger stroke path and then come back to being light, all in one stroke. So yeah, and then the focal shift is kind of the feather for your mask. So you can see right here what we haven't talked about yet is kind of alphas and strokes. So the stroke, like I've said before, is going to be basically like what you're doing with the brush. So the dots are just like a typical, you're going to point out each, like a brush stroke basically. So it's just going to follow along with your pattern, and you can kind of tell on this clay buildup brush, but what it's doing is it's drawing this alpha out, and it's using that as your brush tip. So if I was going to change this to like this circle, you'll see I'm no longer drawing with that squared pattern, but it's that dot pattern. And why it's called dots is because this brush isn't truly drawing out that stroke over and over again. It's actually doing dot, 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 dot repeatedly as fast as you can move it. And I believe if you even come into the panel, you can change these settings here and adjust the spacing and things like that for these dots. Freehand is the same thing, but it's just a little bit faster. You can see it's kind of a little tighter on these. Maybe that's the one that lets you adjust your mouse averages or something. Yeah. And then drag rectangle is actually going to draw this shape out. So if you are doing like stars, or you needed that sphere to appear and you just needed one, or you're wanting to do some kind of a tiling effect like that, and that's how you draw those out. And then color spray and spray are basically the same thing. The only difference is this colorized spray references your RGB channels. So if you've got like a red or a purple selected here, then it's going to pull from that as well. And what it does is it adds like a variance to it. So you're going to be painting with, like if you were painting with red, it wouldn't just be a solid red. So just to give you guys a quick introduction to this, let me pop over under your material and go to this matte cap white. Let's change on RGB. So this up here controls what you're painting on with your mouse, or with your brush rather. So if you've got just material selected, you're only going to be painting with this material channel through. If you have RGB selected, you're only going to be painting with the color palette and not the material. And if you have material RGB, you're painting with both the material and the color at the same time. So that's like if you were wanting to do like parts of it chrome versus parts of it matte and stuff like that, you would change this material and be painting with a separate material instead. And of course, if you have them all off, then all you're doing is the Z add and subtract. So let's take off our Z add and turn on RGB and select our color spray. And so just to give you guys an example of what this is doing, you can see it's not just the red, but it's a variance of that red. It's kind of hard to see here. Let's do color and fill object with white. Now we want to paint with red. There we go. And this is kind of an alternate color patch. So we talked about these before. What this is going to be is this is your selected color, and this is the alternate color. So if I was going to do like an alternate color of blue, and I hold down Alt and draw, now I'm painting in blue, and now I'm painting in red. And that's what this spray paint. But as you can see, what the spray paint does, the whole point in showing you this, is to show these weird color variances that you can get. So it's not just red, but it's pulling a sample of different colors around that red to paint as kind of a matted object. So if you took like, if you want to do like a much less focal shift on this brush, and pulled it up and said kind of like this, you can see it's a lot more blurred out now. And that's what this focal shift controls, is the intensity of those. So if you see here, it's going to be really solid round circles, and if I turn this focal shift down, see it's a much more blurred pattern. Into alphas, and we've talked about the color spray, and then the generic spray is just, it's that same technique, that same pattern, with less color variance in it. And so now you're painting variances of red in that intensity channel, but you're not painting like multiple, like you won't see any oranges or yellows coming through on it. And then we can do drag dots, which is basically like dragging it out and placing what you wanted. Okay, and then alphas are, all of this functions just like the brushes, and all these are like a black and white image where the black is 0 and white is 1. So if you're going to like create your own alphas in Photoshop, it's pretty easy. You're thinking just like you would any kind of an alpha tip for if you've done brushes in Photoshop before, it's the same principle. So if we took this brush tip and went to like a drag dot, you can draw out that shape. And you can combine any number of these. So if you come into a color spray with this alpha on, now you're spraying those dots. And that's kind of the basic theory for poly painting and sculpting in ZBrush. I know we're getting kind of late on time here. Man, this thing runs a lot longer than I would think it would. How much time we got left, Richard? 30 minutes or so? Okay. I can try and wrap it up. So we've covered a lot of the basics here. We've gotten into poly painting, lattices, the poly groups a little bit. Let's go ahead and talk about textures. That's kind of the next step up. So textures aren't reading a color, it's reading an image. And so it's kind of intercepting your RGB channel. And if you wanted to apply that to a brush, and you want to make sure that, once again, you're always wanting to be in this RGB here, now you're actually painting that texture out. And so you can get really kind of clever and creative with these. Where you're basically just painting these textures onto an object. And this can be, it's just like anything else. If you wanted to import new textures, you can. And you're just applying that to the brush and drawing them out. So whatever your heart desires. It's pretty easy to get some really cool effects with those things. Now, where this gets really confusing is this is a texture for your brush, not a texture for the geometry itself. So if you were going to think about how polygons and things like that actually work, and you're taking them into other engines. So we touched on this a little bit earlier, where you can't take these really, really high resolution vehicles into other programs. These are huge objects, and we're at almost 1 million polygons already. And you can probably get away with that, but it's not going to function real well. It's definitely not something you want to animate, and it's really heavy on the system. So what you would do in those kind of cases is you're actually going to start working towards retopologizing all of this and getting it back into a usable state. There's a bunch of ways to go about that. I think one of the simplest ones is going to be to duplicate this object. So if we come down, now we've got 2 subtools, and they're the same thing. And just for making things simple for now, let's go ahead and do the Z-Remesher. So ZBrush has, one of the coolest things about it is outside of Dynamesh, it also has another remeshing sword called Z-Remesher. And this is kind of your quick low poly count generator for ZBrush. So you've got this crazy high polygon object, and you need to get it back into a usable state. You're going to come over here and say Z-Remesher and turn that on, and it's going to come through and re-crunch on all this stuff. Now, it takes it a little while on these heavier pieces. So what we can talk about while it's crunching is how this is going to work is this is setting its target poly count in numbers of thousands. So I've said right now I want it to be 5,000 polygons by the time it reduces this down. You can play with a lot of things. So if you wanted to say this adapt is what references this target poly count. So if you just said, okay, well, I know I want it to be half of what I'm at now, you can select that and it'll switch it to that instead. Some of these other options up here are going to be the keep groups, freeze groups, and freeze borders. And what this freeze borders will do is it's going to try and preserve your edges a little bit better. And so any of these sharper lines, it's going to try and hold on to that. Polygroup, freeze groups, and freeze borders are actually going to be more for poly grouping, which we haven't touched on a whole lot yet, and I don't think we're going to get into too much. But essentially, it's the masking agent of ZBrush. So if you wanted to do like turn on your polyframes, it's the only way to actually see polygroups. And so right now, all of this is one color. That means it's one polygroup. If I was going to say, let's mask this off. Oh yeah, that's another thing, masking. So if you want to mask things off in ZBrush, let's turn off our polyframe. And so if you're drawing on this mask, now anything that I've got selected here, I can't sculpt on. Let's actually go back to Z-add, get normal brush. You notice as I get further and further into this mask, it's not going to let me touch on it. If I expand this out more, now I can't draw here. And that's all that masking group is it's a preventative zone, basically. You're going to use that anytime you're trying to move whole portions of the objects, or you've got alphas that you're trying to work with, things like that. Now where it becomes really cool is with polygroups. And polygroups are this kind of weird ethereal thing that ZBrush has, and you don't really understand it until you get deeper into it. But what they're used is for masking off sets of geometry. And so if I wanted, say, this piece here to be a different polygroup than the rest of the object, I can come over here and group masked. It's going to be a lot clearer here. You can see this is all one color. I go into group masked. Now it's a different polygroup. And what this really is for is ZBrush, once you get into some of the more advanced functions for it, it'll start looking for polygroups for different borders for their functions. So if you wanted to like polish it, and you wanted it to polish along these polygroups, then it would sharpen up that edge for you. And so basically you're using it as a definition tool. Or if you wanted to have a different piece and you're wanting to select this out. So say you wanted to separate this away from the rest of the geometry. You can duplicate your subtool, and then control select that, and come in here into your geometry tablet, and go to geometry, modify topology, and delete hidden. And now this is the only geometry here. So then you can come back into this one, control shift click on your other one, and then go to modify topology, geometry, modify topology, delete hidden. And so now they're two totally separate pieces. You can move those apart from each other. And then dynamesh it back on purpose. So that is polygroups and masking. So back to where we were before we got carried away on that tangent. Oh, another thing to keep in mind, ZBrush keeps a track of all of your history while you're working. So if you've ever gotten too far ahead of yourself, you can always just grab this little slider here and follow it all the way back to the beginnings of this subtool. And it does that for each and every subtool that you're working on. So if I wanted to take this one, move it all the way back. So this is a lot shorter since it's our much newer tool, since we duplicated it out earlier. You can take it all the way back to before we remeshed it. And it just maintains that history for you. So what we want to do is right there probably is good. So once again, as we were talking about before, you can't take these high resolution models into other software. So what you've got to do is bake this information into this lower res version. And you're going to do that with normal maps and texture maps. So say we've got this object and we've got it all prettied up like we want. We want these textures on it, and we want all this color information, and we want this high resolution information. What you're going to do is an easy way to go about this. Like I said, 1,000 ways to skin a cat in this program. If you duplicate your subtool and come in and go to your UV map. Now that's one of the first things that you need to create. Now here we've got to go back a little ways and kind of talk about the theory behind what polygons are and how texture maps and UV maps are all referenced from each other. So you know that deep down all of these objects are just squares. They're just a bunch of squares and triangles that have all been linked together in different ways to form shapes. Now imagine if you took that shape and we're going to lay it flat and just totally unwrap it. What would that look like? It's probably what your UV is going to look like. And that's kind of the theory behind it. So any time you're seeing like a texture map on a game object, all that is they've taken that geometry and laid it out on a flat surface. And then on that flat surface that they've laid that geometry onto, they're applying color information and height information and depth information and sometimes like even material information, lighting, ambient occlusion, stuff like that, how much it glows. And they're all telling that in different spots on these maps. And so that's what a UV map is. So let's come over here. It's been an age and a half since I've done this. But I believe it's a plugin. And UV master, here we go. So let's just grab let's close up these. Let's grab our Z plugin. Just pull this over here. Now what these are going to be is if you're coming into your UV master, it's going to try and unwrap this geometry and lay it flat. Now, sometimes it does a decent job on its own. So let's just hit unwrap and see what it gives us. Now it's going to start crunching on this. What it's trying to do is figuring out the best way to lay all of this geometry flat on a surface. And it's going to cut it up into different portions. And once it's done, generate in 7 seconds, and lay it flat. So if we say this flatten, now we've laid it flat. And now this gives you probably a little bit of a better example of what I was talking about before. This is still the same object that we were working on previously, but it's cut it along this seam line here to try and lay it flat on this plane. And so how this works is what it'll do is it's looking at all of this for depth information. And that's what your UV map is your ins and outs and ups and downs. And once you can create all of that and put it together, it's going to say, this is the low resolution geometry, but I want the lighting to react as if it has this high detail information on top of it. Essentially, you're painting a height map on top of your polygons. And so that's what your UVs are going to be. And so once those have been created, come to unflatten, and I believe unwrap should be good to go. So if we come over here to, I believe, polypaint, texture map, here we go. So we can create a new texture from our polypaint once we have all of this applied to the object. So we had to create this UV map so that it has UVs to apply things to. What you want to do now is come back up into your subtool palette. And this is by far the most complicated process we're covering today. But you're going to actually project this information down onto the subtool below it. And so to make sure that we can do that, we know we've got about 900,000 polygons, about 1 million, on this tool right here. So we want to make sure that this one, at its highest subdivisional level, has about 1 million polygons. Right now we've only got about 10,000 on here. So if you duplicate this up, and now we've got 2.5 million polygons. It's more than enough to cover the geometry we're trying to project onto it. So if we come into our subtools, and come in here to project, and project all. And we just want to increase this shell. I think you project from the top down. So we want to select the bottom shell, change this projection loop. Now this is just controlling how much it's going to govern out. So how far out from itself is it going to look for that geometry? Well, I said that's what it was going to do. Why do we not have a projection lever? All right, well, the glory of live streams is that sometimes things don't work the way you would expect them to. All right, let's try duplicating view again. Nope, still not going to let us project. Okay, well, to be honest, I'm not perfectly sure what's going on here. But we're getting kind of close on our time frame anyway. So let's kind of move on from this. Theoretically, what would happen is you can project this high resolution detail onto the lower resolution model. And so once you've got that done, you'll come in here and say you had created your UV maps from it. You had everything on this pretty like you want it. You then come back into your polypaint and tell it to create a texture from that polypaint. Now it sees it as all white, but you can see where it's got this texture map, that UV map that we created earlier, and that's what it's referencing. So it's the same principle there, is it's just applying that white to the thing overall. So if we came in here and let's turn off that texture. So here's the color we're working with. Let's color, and let's fill this object with white. Man, it's just loving to mess with me today. There it goes. And say we wanted to paint just some red streaks on this, or something real simple. There we go. So you've got these red stripes, and you need those stripes to be on your model. If you can go new from Polypaint now, as you can see on this cube, now we've got those stripes applied to the texture. So that's all it's doing, is just flattening out what you've got and applying a color map to it on a flat image. You should be able to do the same theory now with our normal maps. So if we come in here, we can go all the way. You want to be at the highest resolution for your Polypaint and the lowest resolution for your normal maps. Because the Polypaint is going to look at every pixel that's on there and say, okay, what's the color information associated with this pixel? And it's going to pull that onto your texture map. So if you've got it set to the lowest texture, the lowest geometry setting, it's only going to reference the Polypaint for 10,000 pixels, not for the 100 million or whatever you're painting at. And so basically you're going to do the same thing with UV maps, except in reverse. And so if you wanted to normal map and say create normal map, it's going to look at whatever the highest resolution geometry is, bases your lowest. So you want to be at the lowest geometry you've got, and it's going to go, how high do I need to go to capture all that information? And from that, it's creating your bump detail. So if you go create normal map, it'll think about it for a minute. And then you will have this little normal map. It's kind of hard to see here. Let's actually copy this over to our texture palette. Normal map. So it's over here on your textures. Actually, let's pull up the spotlight. That'll let us show it. Why not? Got a little bit of time. We're kind of off the beaten path here anyway. So once you've got a texture set up here, if you come into this texture setting, you can turn on the Z spotlight and add it to it. And now the spotlight is kind of the projection tool I had mentioned before. And this lets you basically move images around inside of ZBrush. And you can scale these, rotate them, and do different things like that. If you click inside this circle out here, you're moving the object. If you click within the circle, you're moving your little reticle. But you've got everything from scale, rotate. You can paint through it in the intensity, hue, saturation, smudge. It's basically like a little mini Photoshop here. Now what you would use this for is if you wanted to paint your object through. If you hit Z, you're going in and out of your spotlight. So if I wanted to paint like this normal map through to the object, which you wouldn't typically want to do for any reason, but, oh, I know, I've got it. So we have this texture map still turned on, so you're not seeing anything that we're painting through it. But you can actually paint that normal map through to the object, or any image through to it. So if we had, let's say it wasn't our, say it wasn't the normal map, but it was this checkered image, and we want to add that to the spotlight. So now I can take this wood paint, kind of scale it a little bit, get it in place for where I want it, hit Z, and so now I'm editing this object again behind it, and then you can just paint through it. It's a little intense right now, so if we come into the opacity, off to the side, grab our opacity here, and turn it down, down, down. Now you can see what we're working with a little bit better. So let's actually give us a little more poly count to work with. I'm just hitting D to subdivide this up. And now as I'm painting, it's painting that texture onto the model behind it. And so that's what you do with the spotlight. The whole reason I was wanting to show you this was so that we can get a better look at our normal map, which is this guy down here. You can alt-click to select a separate image and just Scale this puppy up. Scale you down. So here you can see it a little clearer. But what that polygon's done is it's painting basically depth information onto your UV map. And so the low resolution version of this can read that and say, okay, now I know when you're taking me into another program, then I can access back through to this. So it's looking at this for your depth information and your texture map for your color information. And you can keep kicking out maps like this for everything under the sun. If you want to get really carried away with it, you can do maps for shadows, for lighting, for ambient occlusion, for materials, all kinds of stuff. And that's when you get into the real like high fidelity versions of these games. And so that's what you're doing. Anytime you're seeing those kinds of game characters, it's all of these different, it's just the low resolution geometry with normal maps, textures and light maps and incandescence maps and everything that you can think of applied on top of it. And it's much, much cheaper to do it like that than to try and bring in some 10 million polygon model where each polygon has a separate face to it. And that's kind of what ZBrush is really great at, is it's the one thing it does that no other program really can well, is that it can work easily with these crazy high number of polygons. And I think this is actually double the amount of points that you see is how many polygons you're working in. And so if you're looking at 4.5 million polygons, or 4.5 million points, that's probably 8 million or 16 million polygons. And so that's way, way higher than anything you'd want to take into a game. But since we've created this normal map, so we've updated our map again. So we're going to say one more time, new from Polypaint, while we're at our highest subdivision level. You can see once again it's updated with our new little texture information. And then we're going to come into our normal map and subdivide all the way back down. This is our more low-res version. And create a normal map from here. It's going to recrunch through all that and say, okay, we know what all the new depth information is. And I think even if you try and create a normal map at your highest resolution, it tells you no, because this map cannot be created while the highest subdivision is active. And the reason is because it's looking for anything more than that to create the subdivision of. So if you're already at your highest resolution, it doesn't have anything to look up to and say, I need to pull this information from. So let's subdivide this down, and this is basically a game-ready object. It's probably not perfect. You probably definitely want to tinker with what your subtools are and things like that a lot more. Huh? Oh, yeah, no kidding, right? Yeah. But in reality, you know, we've got a 5,000 point object with it's one of these that has a low resolution. Oh, it's this guy. So we've got an object that's only about 10,000 polygons that you can take in. That'll work in any kind of software. And so the cool thing about ZBrush, so if you're wanting to take this into, say, Unreal or Unity, you're probably going to want an FBX. Now, ZBrush has a plethora of tools for getting you back outside of your program. You don't want to use any of the traditional ZBrush formats. So if you're going save as in ZBrush, you're saving it as some type of a ZBrush file. So it's either going to be a Z document, a ZPR, which is the overall project file, or a ZTool file, which is what you use for like your brushes and stuff like that. But if you go to export, then you can kick it out as an OBJ from here, or a Maya file. Or if you come into the plugins and say you were wanting to 3D print this, for example, you can come into the, where is it? I believe it's called 3D Print Hub now? Yeah. So this is another new feature. But now you can come in here and tell it if you want it to be inches, what the actual size ratio for the object is going to be. And now this will actually match it to what you have selected. So let's say we wanted it to be a 5-inch piece of modern art. And open this back up. Then you can come into it and go to export to STL to via RML, which is a color 3D printing format. So if you wanted it to take that poly painting information, you can export from here as well. Or you can export to OBJ. Now if you're wanting to go into Unreal or Unity, you're going to want to kick out an FBX, which is your FBX export import. That's what you can do here. And so you can select all of the information that you want it to carry. So we know we want it to keep the normals, layers. I believe there's a texture options on here somewhere. Nope, yep, it's a plugin. Okay, so it is technically a plugin, but all of these plugins come with ZBrush by default. And I believe the FBX export import is in ZBrush Core. I know that the 3D print export is, because that's their whole push for the ZBrush Core has been with 3D printing. And there was a while where the ZBrush Core had more plugins and tools for 3D printing than the full version of ZBrush did. Because that's how hard their push was for it. And so if you went to this export and said we were going to call this our modern art test and save, you'll kick that out. And you notice over here, it also exported our texture map and our normal map. It cloned them over for you and kicked them out. So in theory, perfect world, everything's okay. We've now got a target of our normal map and a target of our texture and our, it's my config file. Oh, there it is. And our FBX, all kicked out for yourself. Now the other cool thing that ZBrush does for, if you were going to take this into Maya and you wanted to get more in-depth into your retopo tools or something like that, or in my case into ZBrush, or into Modo, you just hit this Go Z tool right here. It may not be set up. It's probably looking for Maya right now. Yep, Modo. Okay. So Go Z, and it should automatically kick all this information over for you. And so you don't have to worry about a lot of passing back and forth. And so you make your topology edits in Modo. So say I wanted to come in and just delete a couple of these edge loops or something. Get rid of those and say those were the changes that I wanted to make in Modo. For all that work, then you can just go Z back and say yes. And it'll go through and it'll remap it and do all that fun stuff. But it's essentially saving you all the trouble of having to export new geometry and then import it again and kicking stuff back out and back and forth. We're getting pretty close to the end of our time, so does anybody have any questions? Anything they really wanted to hear about that I didn't cover? Yeah. All right, so the question was, does ZBrush have dynamic topology? Are you talking about like voxels or? Right. Oh, dynamic. Okay. Not that I know of. I wouldn't say that it doesn't, but it's not something that I typically use. I know that you can dynamesh into specific parts. So if you were to mask off an area and then invert that mask so that you've only got a certain area unmasked, and you dynamesh that, you're only remeshing the parts that are unmasked. But as far as doing it on the fly, I'm not sure that that's something that ZBrush does. Anybody else? Is there any mistakes that are usually made early on that we should be aware of? Oh, definitely export this way. Hold these hotkeys, it makes your life easier. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. ZBrush is definitely one of the strangest, most bizarre programs that are out there. But once you understand it, it's incredibly powerful. I think the best analogy I've ever heard is that working in ZBrush is like working in an alien software. It's really bizarre and really hard to understand. But once you grasp the strangeness of it all, you also grasp the great alien power that comes with it. Yeah, Richard.
So next month, since we're going to be looking at Sculptress, I'm just curious if you outline kind of what the differences are, because it's the same company.
Right. Okay. So, and that's kind of the reason that's a good question. So the question was, what are the differences between Sculptress and ZBrush? Sculptress being the free version from Pixologic. They're both made by the same company. And Sculptress we'll be demoing next week with Eric Lee when he's doing his VR stuff. The short version is that Sculptress is the really, 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 really basic version of ZBrush. you've got 3 or 4 brushes and clay that has like one Dynamesh button basically. And so you're just consistently kind of re-resing as you're going through it without any of the other complications to worry about. It's a really great intro for sculpting and stuff like that, but it wasn't necessarily something that we could do a full hour or even really a 30 minutes demo into. That's a program that is almost all art and is definitely a really great stepping stone for getting into this kind of thing. Anybody else? Yeah, absolutely. Oh, you mean separate tools to pull over outside of ZBrush? No. No, not outside of the program itself you can't. At least not that I've tried. I don't know. Maybe it'll prove me wrong. We can find out real quick. Yeah, it doesn't let it leave the bounds of ZBrush. So the question was whether or not you could, ZBrush's customizable menu, if you could take those out into separate menus and dock them on other monitors, in which case you can. Yeah. Yeah, you can't. You can't. Yeah, ZBrush works in one monitor or in one window, almost like it's like running a game engine. Is the analogy I've heard them use when they're talking about the development cycle of it before. Yeah, right. So it's like a windowed program, but you can't pull tools inside this program outside of the window itself. Anybody else? To my knowledge, there may be ZBrush professionals that are watching this video, and are losing their minds right now at my incompetence. Anybody? All right. Well, that's. Do our closing ceremony.
Yeah. Hi, stream people. You know what? I didn't do it before, so I'll get your other monitor. Oh yeah, I was actually going to look up the date for next month. I should have done that earlier before I got back up here. That's all right. So our next meeting is going to be July 20th. We will be looking at Sculptress, also the VR sculpting with Eric Lee from Steelhouse. Some of the things that you saw Mike doing today with his stylus right here, imagine, it's like sculpting in real life, but you're in VR. So imagine digital sculpture in front of you and you're actually hacking away at it with your, I guess, he uses Oculus, right? Yeah. Okay, yeah, so he'll be using an Oculus, so you can see the cool Oculus touch controllers and all that stuff. It's going to be a lot of fun, July 20th, 6 p.m. right here. Thanks again, Michael. And I'm going to kind of slink off the stage and stop the stream now. So, thanks.